Welcome, everyone, to the wide receiver edition of Week 2. We are here with the great Jim McCormick, and then you got to deal with me throughout the course of this video. But before we get started on the wide receivers, let me tell you about coupon code CURVE on rotocurve.com. We, of course, have some fantastic things going on here. If you enter this promo code, you only got to pay $5 for a weekly premium membership, which should cost you $7. So that is quite the deal there. You get exclusive position rankings, projections, cheat sheets for week 1. You have must-have tools like DVP, points per attempt, red zone utilization. I mean, all the stuff that we'll talk about on here. You get optimized DFS lineups for DraftKings and FanDuel. You get access to player ownership percentage. There's so much that I can't fit it into this segment. But once again, just use that promo code CURVE. You only pay $5 instead of $7. That is quite the discount there. Jim, wide receivers this week. We are going to have an interesting little show here because, in my opinion, it's just a week to go for the high, pay up at the position. And I know you might have a little bit of a different take. So why don't you start talking about why you like certain receivers this week and how comfortable you feel spending up there as opposed to, quarterback?
Well, no, I do like spending up. I think paying up for the guys, the big elite guys, makes sense. Like I said in the quarterback video, or actually the running back video as well, like there's a lot of mid-tier running backs this week that I think could vault into usage for, that's like Latavius Murray type guys and even Justin Forsett. These are guys, and even C.J. Anderson isn't going to break your bank. The reason I mentioned those guys, it's affordable to get a good running back, a good backfield. So paying up at receivers, fine. I guess I want to be a little bit less off the complete chalk guys. Not to say A.J. Green isn't chalk. He's still quite amazing. I just think the volume for A.J. Green, all that. Sometimes in the summer we spend the whole year kind of saying something's obvious and it doesn't ever happen. Well, it's fairly obvious that Marvin Jones, Sanu, Tyler Eifert, that's like 250 targets are gone from the Bengals. That's quite a market to pick up. I do think that there's a real chance, if not likelihood, that A.J. Green leads the league in targets this year. He caught 10 of 11 targets last week, which is ridiculous. A lot of those are 15 yards downfield, so they're valuable. The other thing is he's averaged 139 yards and 3 touchdowns, or 139 yards per game over the last 4 games against the Steelers, 3 touchdowns over that span. I think we saw on Monday night there could be some shootout ingredients with this Steelers team. They also had no sacks against the Redskins. Tuitt and Hayward, they're main edge guys. They're not really pass rushers as much as amazing. They create pressure, but there's not a whole lot of sacks. So I think there's an issue there with letting Dalton have time, who you like at quarterback, and getting deep to A.J. Green. I also like Allen Robinson just on volume. Verrett is a nice corner, Jason Verrett for the Chargers. He could shadow him. That didn't seem to bother Macklin so much, but I just think Robinson's a different guy. If you go back and look at the tape of Robinson last week, he was really not that far from having 200-plus yards and multi-touchdowns. There was just some small misses and misfires with Bortles. I think the volume will be there. He had 15 targets, led all receivers last week. I just think everything's there for Allen Robinson to return value. Plus, you save $1,500 from the super elite guys.
Yeah, it does scare me, though. I mean, that San Diego group of corners might be the best in football, them or Denver or a few other spots, but they're in the top 2 at the conversation, so that scares me a little, whereas you can have guys like Antonio Brown, Julio Jones, and Odell Beckham and Cash, who are just absolute locks, in my opinion, and it's
right.
Really hard to find downside for any of them. So, on Fantasy Draft, there is a way to fit 3. I'm trying to figure it out. You're probably going to have to fade either the defense or the tight end that you want, or both to make it happen, but it can work. On DraftKings, you definitely want to. And let's make the case for each, even though they are blatantly obvious. I mean,
Right.
Antonio Brown, even if Adam Jones does shadow him, which Josh Norman did not last week, I mean, I don't think Adam Jones is in the tier of corners that really worries me. Otherwise, we'll be seeing Kirkpatrick, and that definitely doesn't worry me. So Antonio Brown, just a monster, by far the best receiver in the game. worth spending up for because of his ridiculously high floor. I mean, he's going to lead the league in receptions probably again after 136 last year. Then you got Julio Jones against Oakland, who allowed the most fantasy points to wide receivers in week 1. Again, they allowed 56 fantasy points. We saw that long touchdown to Cooks. I think Snead scored as well. So Julio Jones looked like Julio Jones. They're going to find a way to get him the ball. He tied in receptions for the receptions lead with Brown last year, so they're both monsters. And then Odell Beckham against New Orleans. We saw that game last year. While I don't think the game's going to go exactly the same way, he did score 3 touchdowns. They did lose Delvin Breaux last week. I think Odell Beckham's going to be the highest owned player maybe of the week at any position because of that 3 touchdown game last week, because it's the Saints that everyone knows, because he's a big name, because he's from New York. I think we might approach 30 to 35% ownership, but I get why. I mean, this is just a no-brainer. So, in cash, you need 3 receivers. I want to fit at least 2 of those guys. If I can't fit all 3 of them, I'm willing to use a guy like Steve Smith, who was targeted 9 times last week. If he gets targeted 9 times this week against this bad Cleveland defense, I mean, I think that's going to translate to more production than just 5 catches for, I think it was 19 yards. It wasn't very much, but I think until he gets to 1,000 receptions, he's still chugging along. He's still motivated. This is a fair price tag. You talked about Flacco and the quarterbacks. I kind of like it too. But I think Smith is a guy who's a possession receiver for 4,300. If he sees 9 targets, I definitely think he's going to crush value there. Let's go to tournaments, because tournament is where you differentiate. Now, do I want one of the top receivers in my tournament lineup? Absolutely. I'm not sure I want 2. I think there's going to be other guys who go off. So let's see which way you direct this. Who do you like in tournaments?
Yeah, no, just to pair off what you were saying, I had this note here while I was building out lineups that, you can get 2 elites. I think it makes more sense. 3 is difficult because then you're going bottom dollar everywhere else. But if you were looking for a bottom dollar tight end, we don't do a tight end segment, but Dennis Pitta, just another guy. He had 32 routes run, and Flacco just wants to get that guy the ball. They're like besties. But I think, if you do afford 2 of these elites we're talking about, even if you spend up for the guys you're talking about, say you want Beckham and Brown, instead of a guy like Steve Smith, who I think might just be – I think the Crypt Keeper might be here for him. I think you might want to go after Mike Wallace in the same team. He's about 9 years younger, or maybe 8. I don't know. He's 30 years old, I guess. The other thing is that his average depth of target last week was 16 yards downfield, whereas Smith – all of his stuff's coming 3 and 4 yards. I just don't trust the yak. But again, I understand the premise. He is going to get 8+ targets, so that's a good premise. With Wallace, I think even if he gets 5 or 6 targets, they're downfield, as we saw in the 66-yard touchdown. Let's not go chasing deep touchdowns, but I do chase deep usage. There's a difference because he's going to have a continuous ability to produce the big opportunities. It's not just 1 or 2 strikes downfield with Flacco. It's going to be more like 5 or 6. Flacco was also 8 of 10 on throws past 15 yards. A lot of that had to do with Mike Wallace. Another guy who is seen as a vertical guy, but his volume might go up, is Travis Benjamin. Obviously, Keenan Allen's out, but he's still affordable. This 1-week gap between the injury and this week, Benjamin's price can't, fluctuate too greatly on these markets. The other thing is with Benjamin is last week was inefficient. He had some good coverage against him there with, Peters and that quality secondary there that you have in Kansas City. I think you're going to see a big difference here. I do think you're going to see 10 to 12 targets, but I also think he can exploit this Jacksonville secondary. So those are some guys I like in tournaments: Mike Wallace, Travis Benjamin. I even like Tajay Sharp, that you mentioned. He might even get into cash conversation as that complimentary third guy if you're going to pay up.
Yeah, the only reservation I have about Sharp in cash games is the matchup against Darius Slay. I think whoever's matched up against him is probably going to have a difficult time. While Sharp looks good, I mean, this is still one of the upper echelon corners, and we don't know how he'll react there just yet. So I'm not really comfortable with using him in cash games, even though I do love his prospects for the long haul. And Travis Benjamin's a guy who I'm going to wait on the status of Amukamara because he came out of that game with a hamstring issue. And if Amukamara plays, I actually think I prefer Tyrell Williams of those receivers. He was targeted 5 times, mostly after Keenan Allen left the game. So he only hauled in 2 of them, but I do think he's a decent little player. He's priced at 3,700, which is damn near the minimum. So if you're differentiating in tournaments, I think he makes sense. I think he could be one of those. Both him and Benjamin might be those guys who are targeted downfield, which makes it nice. And we already know I like Rivers from that quarterback video. And Larry Fitzgerald's kind of the mid-tier guy that I like. I know he scored 2 touchdowns last week, but he's a guy I feel comfortable going back to the well against. Tampa Bay, none of those corners really scare me. Julio Jones was nice against them last week. I know Michael Floyd barely missed some touchdowns. He was targeted a lot inside the red zone, but Fitzgerald's the one who converted. He's, Carson Palmer's kind of safety nest, and I think he'll be that again this week. And then you kind of, we mentioned Sharp, but another guy who I kind of like for cheap with that Josh McCown show is Terrell Pryor against the Baltimore Ravens. He's 3,500, so he's even cheaper than Tyrell Williams on DraftKings. And he's kind of proven to me pretty, throughout the preseason, I was a little skeptical, but he looked pretty good last week. If he's got a quarterback who can find him, I think he's got a chance to, put up a decent little week. Right now, he looks better than Corey Coleman to me. So while I guess both of them got to be in play against the secondary, I mean, Pryor looks like the better receiver to me. He may match up against the number 1 corner, but they don't have any corners to scare me. So Pryor for that cheap price. If McCown is decent, his guy was Barnage last year, but there's no reason he shouldn't be able to find Terrell Pryor as well. So that's who I like in tournaments. Did we miss anyone at the wide receiver position?
I didn't get to Jordan Matthews, but I just think, again, he's still pretty affordable. As you've mentioned before, the Bears secondary is still kind of banged up. I think it's exploitable to the extent, and also just it's a matter of being locked in. It's a narrative that rookie quarterbacks lock in on guys, but it also comes from some semblance of truth. I do think there's a volume. Obviously, he had 14 targets last week. He was looking for him at his first read almost every time. The fact that he works the slot, I think, is helpful, just because it's all that underneath and in the middle stuff. So Jordan Matthews is a guy who actually profiles for both, I think. The over-under is pretty low in Philly, in that Philly-Chicago game, but I still wouldn't mind shares. I do like Williams that you mentioned. I think just some supporting stats. His average depth of target with the Chargers was 14.7 yards downfield, which is really healthy. He also, like you said, after the half, he was targeted on 21% of his routes, which is like, if you have a 20% share of that high-volume offense, right, there is some upside there. So I definitely agree that Williams might even be more interesting than Benjamin just because of the price, and he might have comparable usage.
Right. There's some guys we didn't get to that I think are going to kind of shock people, especially if they've been listening to me in the preseason. I was way off these Denver wide receivers, but I think if Demaryius Thomas plays, he's listed as questionable, that I have some interest in Demaryius Thomas. I think Simeon looked better than I thought he would, and these Colts corners without Vontae Davis are absolutely awful. So Demaryius Thomas, 6,400, kind of in that Fitzgerald price range. He's a way to, differentiate from the top guys who I think, could have, I don't want to say he's got the same upside as those guys, but he's got, at least 4 or 5 fantasy points below type upside, which is good enough if you spend your money elsewhere. And a guy who's kind of under the radar, we didn't even discuss him, but I did a matchup breakdown on this game the other day. How about Jamison Crowder, who was targeted 10 times? And you look at those Dallas cornerbacks, both of them are pretty solid on the outside, but the inside, they're definitely beatable. So, if they're targeting Garcon, if they're targeting Jackson, I think they'll be inefficient. But Crowder on the inside, who caught 6 passes this week, I think he could be a catch machine once again. For the long term, I like Doxson. When and if he gets an extended opportunity, I think he will shine. But I think in this short term, Jamison Crowder could be a nice source of receptions. He's only 3,600, so he's in that Terrell Pryor, Tyrell Williams range. I actually think he could be viable for cash games. I really like him that much. So Jamison Crowder, an interesting name. Let's go to our staples for this week, Jim. Who do you like in cash games? Who do you like in tournaments? Who are the guys you're going to be building around?
The guys that I'm going to be building around, there's some overlap between the guys we mentioned. AJ Green will be in almost every lineup of mine. I think if you have him and Allen Robinson together, you can do pretty well. It's not exactly the same as having OBJ and Brown. So I can appreciate your idea of paying up, but I do want to get 2 studs. Is kind of the premise investing wise. 2 superstar studs, 2 guys that are over 7,500 at receiver. Even going over 8,000 is fine. just because of the amount of guys we mentioned. I like Wallace a lot. I know you like Smith. I just think there's a lot more juice with Wallace. Sharp, like we both said. I'm actually in on Sharp. I don't think Slay isn't a guy who shadows guys. He doesn't follow them around. I wouldn't be surprised if they moved Sharp around a little bit too to get him untracked, just because I don't think they're going to want to throw him to the Wolves the whole day and just line him up on Slay's side. It's just traditionally Slay doesn't shadow, and they don't do that in Detroit so far, so that's something to look for. Victor Cruz is one guy we didn't mention. I'm not really in on Victor Cruz, but I think there is a thing where Eli wants to get him the ball. It's like a narrative play, but he force-fed him the ball there late, and it's not like he was doing that in the first quarter. That was in crunch time. That was till he scored the game-winning touchdown for the Giants. So I think there's something to be said there. I know that's, again, a narrative play, but he's going to have just as much of a market share as Shepard, and he's going to have a lower price tag, so that's not the worst. Ty Williams, like we said. If you want to go really, really deep in tournaments, Inman's actually listed as the starter for San Diego. I just don't like him and his talent. But, he only had 6% target per route. But that's neither here nor there because we're probably not going to use him. But, yeah, that's pretty much it. Again, also in cash, one guy we didn't mention who's really popular among the sleeper crowd going into the season, Marvin Jones. I was telling you before the show started, his price didn't jump enough, I think, for what we saw. I think it's pretty obvious. Not only could he be the leading target on the Lions, he's the downfield target. And that Tennessee secondary is exploitable. I wouldn't worry about what happened with the Vikings. Actually, Sean Hill actually completed, I think 7 or 8 passes past 10 yards. So there's plenty to like there. They just didn't get in the end zone. I think there's real potential for them to beat up this secondary this week.
Yeah, and I'm going to kind of echo your sentiments on the 2 top guys, except I'm going to go with different ones. I think for cash games, if you can afford them, Antonio Brown and Odell Beckham will help you sleep at night. I think, 40% of the pool in some of the lower 50-50s, maybe even more than that, are going to have Beckham. So at least if he has a quiet game, you're with the crowd. If he has a huge game, and you roster one of those other guys, then it's going to be a difficult afternoon as you try and catch up. Then I think in cash games as my wide receiver 3, I guess I'm going with Steve Smith. I feel confident about it. I think this defense is that bad that you can use an old guy like this, who I'm not really in love with overall. Then for tournaments, Tyrell Williams, Terrell Pryor, and I think Larry Fitzgerald, again, even after those 2 touchdowns, are guys that I'm going to be focusing around, with Jamison Crowder as a guy that I kind of have a little exposure to, depending on roster construction. He's cheaper than some of those running backs we talked about. So as a flex play or something like that, I think Crowder will come through for you. But that's all for us, unless you got any other takes at the wide receiver position. I'm
good. I think we covered a lot of the guys. There's some overlap with what we like. We actually mentioned it you kind of mentioned Jay Cutler earlier. I think Alshon with McKelvin hurt for the Eagles. We didn't mention him. I'm throwing it in here late. But he's a guy who's in that 7,700 range on both, on the 2 main sites, and he's affordable enough to get shares of, but it really just tournament style. I think that game, that point total's too low to get him in cash. But still, just the idea. We didn't mention Alshon. I had a note here just to kind of. I think they could pick on the outside corners for Philly.
Yeah, and he looked really good last week. He's one of those guys who, when he's healthy, you use him kind of like Sammy Watkins. Watkins is not healthy, so not a good week to use him. But that is all for this. But before we go, again, remember, save $2 on a weekly membership at RotoCurve by entering promo code CURVE. You get position rankings, projections, cheat sheets, DFS tools like DVP, points per attempt. You get optimized lineups. You get access to player ownership percentage. You get everything your heart would desire for only $5 instead of $7. So use that. Stay tuned, as Jim and I still have another video for this week. We will be talking about some stacks.